Good day. Today is Tuesday, 15th April 2025, and we've had many developments in the conflict in Ukraine, all of which are very interesting and which also point perhaps to a moment when the United States finally makes its decision to part company with Ukraine and with the extraordinary personality of President Zelensky. Now, speaking of President Zelensky, he has given an interview on CBS, 60 Minutes, an extraordinary long, rambling interview, not always a very coherent one, as far as I'm concerned, and I don't pretend or intend to pass it or to discuss it in any very great detail. It was very much the same things that Zelensky always says, and which come back to his core views. But ultimately, what the interview did, what it clarified, is the fundamental and simple fact that despite claims that one occasionally reads and hears across the media in the West, in Europe especially, that over the last few weeks he's taken a big step towards peace by supposedly agreeing to President Trump's demand for an unconditional ceasefire. In fact, and in reality, he is not prepared to shift 1 inch, 1 millimeter from his fundamental underlying positions. He still says that he doesn't want to negotiate with the Russians. He speaks about his personal loathing and hatred even of President Putin of Russia, an admission which probably speaks to the truth, but which obviously makes negotiations with the Russians very, very difficult. But anyway, there we go. He clearly has no intention of revoking or setting aside his 2nd October 2022 decree, which prohibits everybody in Ukraine from negotiating with Russia whilst President Putin remains its leader. There are times when Zelensky himself has insinuated that he is personally authorized to conduct negotiations with the Russians and with Putin, but that no one else is. I've read the decree. I'm not sure that's what it means at all. But anyway, put that aside. The fact is that when he says that he hates President Putin, it's difficult to see how he's going to be in any condition or position to conduct a negotiation. Anyway, there we go. So he's not prepared to negotiate, and it's quite clear that he's not really prepared to shift on any underlying position that he has taken ever since he walked away from the Istanbul Agreement that was almost there and almost agreed in April 2022, and the further position that he took a few weeks later when he announced his so-called peace plan, which basically is a demand for the complete unconditional withdrawal of all Russian forces from every millimeter of pre-2014 Ukrainian territory, including, of course, Crimea itself, the return of all of those territories ultimately to Ukraine, the negotiations which would then be basically about the scale of Russian reparations to Ukraine, war crimes trials of Russian military officials, and that kind of thing. A peace plan that has absolutely no fundamental, no prospect at all of being accepted by the Russians, by any conceivable Russian government that I can imagine, even assuming that President Putin himself was suddenly to die or fall ill or something were to happen to him. Just saying. All of this, even as President Zelensky himself acknowledges that it's very unlikely, all but impossible, in fact, for the Ukrainian military to recover the territories that Russia occupies in what he defines, and it must be said, the rest of the world, apart from Russia, defines as Eastern Ukraine. So he cannot win the war militarily, but he's not prepared to do any of the things diplomatically that might end it. He will only end it on his own terms. He was very reluctantly and very grudgingly forced to agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire by the Americans. This happened, it's perhaps worth remembering, at a meeting between American officials, senior American officials, and Ukrainian officials, which took place in Saudi Arabia in Jeddah. Zelensky himself was kept away from that meeting, obviously by the Americans, and the Ukrainians themselves were obliged to meet with the Americans in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, not in Europe, precisely, one suspects, because the Americans wanted to isolate the Ukrainians and keep them away from holding contacts and discussions with their European friends. The Ukrainians then very grudgingly agreed to an unconditional ceasefire, one which Zelensky up to that point had consistently opposed and rejected. He rejected the unconditional ceasefire idea when he attended the White House and had that stormy meeting with Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. He went on insisting throughout that meeting that he wanted security guarantees before he would sign a ceasefire agreement. He then found that his officials had agreed to an American demand for Ukraine to commit to an unconditional ceasefire, but clearly he shows no enthusiasm for any further step that goes beyond that and which might lead to peace. At the same time, and this is not something covered so much as I understand it from, well, not so much in the CBS interview, he also basically is digging in about the mineral rights extraction deal. Now, on this, perhaps one can have some sympathy with him. A deal which requires Ukraine to basically hand over indefinitely all of its mineral assets to the United States, its pipelines, its gas pipelines from Russia, from the United States, all of that, in return for, well, basically nothing at all, would be an extraordinary thing for any political leader to give up. But I will say this, I can understand why Zelensky is not prepared to sign that mineral rights extraction agreement. But he must know that by doing so, he's antagonizing Donald Trump and the administration. And if he really wanted to remain on good terms with the United States and perhaps renegotiate that mineral rights extraction agreement and change its terms to something more beneficial to Ukraine, well, one would expect him in that case to finally do what the Americans have been constantly urging him to do, which is to take some real positive steps towards agreeing to peace with the Russians and ending the war, a war which, without the assistance of the United States, Ukraine is definitely going to lose, and which, even with the assistance of the United States, in time it is going to lose. Well, as I said, Zelensky, as he has consistently done, as has been the hallmark of his policies and his personality and his positions ever since the summer of 2022, is not prepared to budge or shift. He's not prepared to make any moves at all. He's basically digging in. And whenever it seems that he makes a concession, for example, of NATO membership or something of that kind, or on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, it becomes very, very clear that this concession is not meant seriously. Within a few days, demands are repeated again that Ukraine will be a member of NATO at some point, that it insists on that right. And in addition, Zelensky obviously shows no interest at all in making any fundamental concessions on any of the other things, or even partial concessions on any of the other things that would be needed to make peace. Re-establishment of the Russian Orthodox Church, for example, provisions to protect the use of the Russian language in Ukraine, anything of that kind at all. Anyway, this interview on CBS appears to have infuriated Donald Trump. He came out, and it was apparently this interview that caused Trump to make that comment on Truth Social, which I'm now going to read in full. I discussed it briefly in my previous program, but I will now read it more thoroughly. The war between Russia and Ukraine is Biden's war, not mine. I just got here, and for 4 years during my term had no problem in preventing it from happening. President Putin and everyone else respected your president. I had nothing to do with this war, but am working diligently to get the death and destruction to stop. If the 2020 presidential election was not rigged, and it was in so many ways, that horrible war would never have happened. President Zelensky and crooked Joe Biden did an absolutely horrible job in allowing this travesty to begin. There were so many ways of preventing it from ever starting, but that is the past. Now we have to get it to stop, and fast. So sad. Well, the point here is that not only is Trump correctly pointing out that he was not president when the war began in February 2022, and that whilst he was president during his first term, there had been no war in Ukraine, and that he actually had a cordial relationship with President Putin at that time. But he's quite clearly here indicating who he believes were the parties that really were responsible for the war, for the beginning of the war, and he identifies them, and he says President Zelensky and crooked Joe Biden. Now, here I get to say something. I think Trump actually is being more accurate than he himself even knows. I want to reiterate at this point my own belief that the war that took place in February 2022, that began in February 2022, was to a great extent an intended war. I remember that soon after Biden's election, Zelensky began to change Ukrainian doctrines, Ukrainian military doctrines. He began to recast those military doctrines to provide for a possible Ukrainian military offensive to recapture Donbass, the two Donbass republics, the DPR, the LPR, and even Crimea. And of course, in the first weeks of 2021, perhaps in pursuit of that objective, he started to organize and assemble large numbers of troops on the contact line, with the DPR and the LPR, and there was a lot of talk about a potential offensive by the Ukrainians at that time against the Russians. Talk, by the way, in Ukraine and in Russia and on the media, though not, of course, in the Western media, where it was instead the Russian counter-reaction, the Russian assembling of around 100,000 men to counter that Ukrainian concentration, which attracted all the attention. So, looking back, I strongly suspect that Zelensky acted in that way because he was receiving encouragement from the people who were to form the new Biden administration to start making those moves. And of course, a couple of days later, around that time, I remember that an article appeared in the website of the Atlantic Council, which identified China as the United States' greatest adversary, spoke in the most astonishingly scathing language about the Chinese leader Xi Jinping, something, by the way, which Trump himself has never done. He has never been abusive about Xi Jinping in a way that that article in the Atlantic Council was, and in ways that President Biden himself, whilst president, also was. But anyway, there was an extraordinarily ferocious article about China, suggesting that China was the major threat to the United States, suggesting that might be the case, a good idea for the United States to make some minor concessions to Russia in Europe, as it was put, in order to persuade the Russians to end their strategic partnership with China. Then, after an apparent de-escalation of this crisis on the contact line in the spring of 2021, there was a meeting arranged between Biden and Putin in Geneva in June. The Russians came away with the impression that the meeting had gone well. The Americans, however, Biden himself included, were apparently extremely dissatisfied when they heard that from Putin that Russia was not prepared to bargain away or negotiate or compromise on its relations with China. And then a few weeks later, in August 2021, the article appeared by Mr. West Mitchell in the National Interest, which said that the United States needed to break the alliance between China and Russia, and that the way to do that was to engineer Russia's defeat in Ukraine, and as a result to change its governmental system and to subordinate Russian foreign policy to the foreign policy interests of the United States. And then thereafter, we had a steady escalation in tensions throughout the autumn of 2021 and a preparation of a massive sanctions attack on Russia, with a huge amount of misdirection as to what that sanctions attack would turn out to be. And that, in the end, brought us to the war. A war which I had thought would not happen, except until the Munich Security Conference in February 2022, when I noticed the sense of euphoria and excitement amongst American and European officials, and indeed President Zelensky himself, as the showdown with Russia and with Putin appeared to be nearing closer, and as preparations for the enormous sanctions that were to come, which were expected to knock out Russia, as the sanctions by this point apparently had already been largely agreed between the various Western powers. Anyway, so I think actually, and I've just gone over the history, but I want to stress again, this is my own interpretation of events, though I am confident that it is true. Very confident that it is true. My own view, as I said, is that this conflict in Ukraine was intentionally engineered. The fighting in the Donbass in February 2022, the shelling of communities in the Donbass was deliberately engineered. precisely in order to provoke the conflict that eventually arose, with the intention of launching this enormous sanctions offensive against Russia, which then, to everybody's dismay and surprise, failed completely. And then, of course, the project of continuing the war by other means continued. We've now had articles in the New York Times and the London Times, both outlining the incredible micromanagement of the Ukrainian side of the war by the Americans and the British. The fact that they not only supplied weapons and arms and ammunition to the Ukrainians, but were also deciding their battle plans, choosing the targets for their missile strikes, sharing with them intelligence, basically running the war in every conceivable respect. So, as I said, when the economic war didn't achieve its objectives, there was a hope that the military conflict, the military war would, except in 2023, at the time of Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive, an offensive which it is now clear, both from the article in the New York Times and from the article in the London Times, the Americans and the British confidently expected to defeat Russia, would lead to the military defeat of Russia, when that instead ended in the military defeat of Ukraine. Well, they all found themselves, the Americans and the British, found themselves at the other end of a plan and of a war that they couldn't end, but which the continuation of which would result ultimately and inevitably in a defeat. Now, that's my own view. I don't know that Donald Trump, in fact, I am quite sure that Donald Trump doesn't know or follow this in any detail. I'm sure he's never read that article by Wes Mitchell or the preceding article in the Atlantic Council. I doubt that he is familiar, for example, with the negotiations between Biden and Putin, which took place in Geneva in June 2021. I doubt that he's also familiar with the tangled and impossible history of the Minsk agreement and the way in which the Ukrainians made clear at the final meeting of the contact group that was supposed to broker the Minsk agreement in February 2022 that they were not going to honour the provisions of the Minsk agreement. I'm sure he's also unfamiliar with the incredibly provocative meeting that took place in January 2021 between Tony Blinken and Sergei Lavrov, in which Blinken not only made it clear that Ukraine would one day join NATO, but that the United States would base missiles in Ukraine. The Russians would just have to accept possible eventual limitations to the number of those missiles, but the right to deploy missiles in Ukraine was apparently not subject to negotiation. An astonishing position for Blinken to take, one which Lavrov has commented about many times, and which, so far as I know, Blinken has never denied, and one which, in the context of the events leading up to the conflict in February 2022, Blinken would surely have known would make that conflict much more likely. So I am sure that Donald Trump is not aware of any of this. I doubt that many people in his administration know about it either. I suspect that by now the paper trail, if it exists, has probably been significantly pruned. And besides, I understand that there are restrictions on what an administration can learn about the policies of its immediate predecessor. Just saying. But anyway, that is my belief. And when Trump says, that the war would never have happened, and that Zelensky and crooked Joe Biden, as he calls him, did an absolutely horrible job in allowing this travesty to begin. He's telling a greater truth than I think he understands. But anyway, let's just say that was one thing that Trump said. And then Trump gave further comments, made further comments about this, and he did this over the course of a meeting with President Bukele of El Salvador in the Oval Office. For the record, President Bukele and President Trump got on extremely well together. I noticed that President Bukele was not wearing a tie or a proper suit any more than Zelensky wears a tie and a suit. He is, shall we say, an eccentric personality in his own way, very different way to Zelensky. But in all other respects, he seems to be very friendly with Trump, and he also seems to be going out of his way to support Trump in all kinds of things. For example, he made it absolutely clear that El Salvador will not return an individual who was deported to El Salvador by the Trump administration, and which a US court has ordered the Trump administration to have returned to the United States because of complications in process, and about which the Supreme Court of the United States has given an incredibly bizarre, ambiguous judgment, which I admit I don't myself understand. I am not going to waste time on it. But anyway, over the course of this meeting with President Bukele in the Oval Office, Trump was asked questions about Zelensky, about the state of the war, about those sort of things. A journalist asked him about President Zelensky's demand for 10 more Patriot missile batteries. And Trump, expressing himself again with some degree of exasperation, said that is what Zelensky always does. He always comes back and demands missile batteries. He says he's going to buy them, by the way, though obviously since Ukraine is entirely without money, it is in fact heading towards a financial collapse. Just saying. Zelensky, to the extent that this demand for 10 Patriot missile batteries is a serious request, he presumably again expects that these missile batteries are going to be provided with someone else's money. Anyway, just saying. But anyway, Trump responded that Zelensky always comes back and makes these demands for missile batteries and all that kind of thing. And he said that, again, this demonstrates Zelensky's folly. I'm being much more measured in my language here than Trump himself was, much more measured than Trump was. Anyway, Trump said that Zelensky always does this. In fact, what he should have done is thought carefully before starting the war. And in this instance, Trump was clearly signaling that he believes that it was Zelensky that played a critical role in starting the war. He said that before starting a war with an adversary who is 20 times more powerful than you, you should measure very carefully the level of your own strength and prepare properly for that war, and realize before the war took place whether you have the ability to fight it and to fight it successfully. And in fact, what Trump said was that Zelensky, far from doing that, provoked that war without making those kind of assessments or preparations, and he's been scrounging around the West and the United States in particular, begging for more and more weapons in order to fight that war ever since. So this is clearly Trump signaling again that Zelensky was responsible for the war. Now, there's been a lot of anger about these words of Trump's in the European media, particularly the British and German media. It's been said that, again, Trump is blaming Zelensky for the fact that the Russians invaded Ukraine. Again, whatever your views about this, even if you don't accept the interpretation of events prior to the war that I outlined at the start of the program, that the war was in fact intentionally provoked and that there was a genuine intention to begin the war in the way that I have said, even if you don't accept that, it is worth repeating that one thing is indisputable to anybody who has followed these events with any degree of care, which is that Ukraine did not honour the provisions of the Minsk agreement, which it signed in 2015, and which Zelensky himself was elected on a platform in which he said that he would move forward with them. It is hardly contested, in fact it is not contested any longer, that Ukraine simply refused to implement the provisions of the Minsk agreement. It refused to enter into direct negotiations with the leaders of the Donbass militia, even though they signed the Minsk agreement, as did Ukraine's own representative, and even though the provisions of the Minsk agreement make the need to do that absolutely clear, and it refused to take any of the other steps that the Minsk agreement outlines, including withdrawing heavy weapons and troops from the contact line. The Ukrainians themselves have made no secret of this, that they did not intend at any time to implement the Minsk agreement, and the German and French leaders at the time, Merkel and Hollande, have straightforwardly admitted that they were aware of that fact and that they went along with it. So, to take issue with Trump, with what Trump says, and to treat Ukraine as a totally innocent party in the breakdown that took place in the entire peace process that had been agreed, hammered out in Minsk in February 2015, and which led to the war that began in February 2022. Well, to do that is to be so partial about the facts that the facts themselves become distorted out of all recognition. Anyway, moving on. That's what Trump said. Now then, Zelensky, of course, fired back, and he made comments again that the Americans are accepting, some American officials, and here again, he clearly had J.D. Vance in mind. It's clear that Zelensky has an intense animus against J.D. Vance. He said something under his breath during the Oval Office meeting about J.D. Vance in Russian, by the way, which I don't intend to translate on this program. But anyway, he clearly has a particular dislike of J.D. Vance. And again, he was talking about how the Americans were accepting, the Trump people in Washington were accepting Russian talking points, which is, again, for me, an absolutely infuriating thing. It means that if you say that, what you're basically saying in advance of negotiations is that you must pay absolutely no attention whatsoever to what the other side is saying. So when the Russians say, for example, that they want Ukraine to become a neutral country and to be outside NATO, and that is something they want to see achieved as part of a peace agreement, saying that the Russians might have good reason to insist on that is simply to repeat a Russian talking point. That kind of attitude takes one absolutely nowhere if one actually wants proper diplomacy and a negotiated solution to the conflict. Well, anyway, Trump will have heard all of this as well, and my conclusion is that the brief, I won't even call it reconciliation, but shall we say relaxation in tensions between the Trump administration and Zelensky and his officials, which we have seen since the meeting in Jeddah when the Ukrainians had were pushed into accepting the administration's demand for an unconditional ceasefire. That period is coming to an end. Ukraine still has its supporters in Washington. I have discussed how within the administration there is a faction led by Kellogg and perhaps Mike Waltz and Rubio, which is more sympathetic to Ukraine. In the case of Kellogg, definitely so. There is also clearly support for Ukraine in Congress as well. Lindsey Graham has come up with his bone-crunching sanctions package against the Russians. We don't seem to be hearing much more about that. And when asked about sanctions against Russia, I noticed that Trump, in another comment, appeared to evade the whole topic. He said that there are already lots and lots of sanctions against Russia. He imposed some of these sanctions himself when he was president before, one of them being against the Nord Stream pipeline, which, as he rightly says, was actually effective. It prevented Nord Stream 2 going into operation when it should have done. I believe that was in 2020. Just saying. Anyway, so that was, or was it? Yeah, 2020. Anyway, that was what Trump said, and he didn't seem to be at all keen over the course of those comments in imposing still more sanctions. But anyway, Lindsey Graham has put together his bill to move forward with sanctions. There's a group of Democrats in the House of Representatives who are also putting together some kind of package which would, if passed, if it were transformed into legislation, it would tie Trump's hands. It would oblige the United States to give some kind of security promises to Ukraine, to continue to provide Ukraine with military and other support, and which would also further tighten sanctions against Russia. I don't think that this particular proposal has any realistic prospect of being passed. I think the House of Representatives, which has a Republican majority, would not vote for it. I think Speaker Johnson, who is now Trump's loyal ally, would prevent it moving forward. And I don't believe that the votes in the House are there for it. But regardless, we can see that Ukraine still has support in Washington. But I think that Trump is gradually coming to the view that Zelensky will never be anything else other than a massive obstacle to the process of achieving peace with Russia that Trump ultimately wants. In the meantime, we've heard an awful lot more from Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, who has given an interview to Fox in which he's provided some information about his meeting with Putin, the meeting which took place in St. Petersburg a few days ago, the one which lasted 4.5 hours. And Witkoff appeared to think that the meeting had gone well. And he spoke about the meeting in, I thought, what looked to me to be positive terms. So Witkoff said that one of the major points that Putin clearly made is that he wanted the whole territory of the four regions, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson, transferred to Ukraine. And he appears to want the fact of the transfer of these regions, to be transferred to Russia. He wants the fact of the transfer of these regions to Russia to be recognized internationally, to receive international recognition, which means basically recognition by the United States. If the United States were to recognize this transfer, I suspect that other states would follow suit. Anyway, Witkoff clearly doesn't seem to have any issue with this. Now, that will be alarming for the Europeans already, but other things that Witkoff said seem to me to be more alarming for the Europeans still, because it's clear that what Putin and Witkoff discussed, apart from possible economic deals between Russia and the United States, and Witkoff mentioned that both Yuri Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy aide, and Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian investment fund, were present in the meeting. But quite apart from economic cooperation, it's clear that Putin again brought up the topic that the Russians tried to draw the interest of the United States and the Europeans to back in the autumn of 2021, even as the countdown to war in Ukraine was starting, and even as the situation the international situation was deteriorating. And this was the Russian desire for a complete restructuring of the security architecture in Europe, or as the Russians now increasingly like to say, Western Eurasia. And the Russians, Putin, apparently were talking about all kinds of things, even the nature of what Article 5, what NATO's Article 5 would mean once these changes to the security architecture were brought about. Now, Witkoff very properly doesn't provide us with a huge amount of detail. But if the indications are true, if what Witkoff is telling us is true, then this looks like a major revolution in the security system in Europe, one in which we would move beyond that system which has existed ever since the end of the Second World War, in which Europe is basically a theatre of a superpower confrontation between the United States and first the Soviet Union and then Russia, to a situation where the United States and Russia basically end that state of confrontation and moved towards some kind of new arrangement where each of their specific interests, security interests, are secured, but in which neither the United States nor Russia have any direct concerns about the future security or status of Europe. So instead of Europe becoming a battleground between the superpowers, it simply becomes another region of the world with the two superpowers, Russia and the United States, able to focus on their own issues, their own concerns, and maybe concerns in other places more important to them. Now, obviously, for the Europeans, that would be extremely alarming, and there is growing concern about this in Europe. You can read this in the media in the West, in Europe today. The Guardian, Telegraph, all of these places, some of the German media as well. But anyway, that appears to have been what Witkoff and Putin discussed with each other. The Russians, in other words, are looking beyond the conflict in Ukraine. They are sure now that they're going to win this conflict. In fact, they have no doubt about that. They obviously want it to end in a way that secures their core interests, so they're not prepared to make concessions about Ukraine itself, concessions that go beyond Putin's June 2024 statement to the Russian Foreign Ministry. But they are looking for some kind of rapprochement with the United States that will lead to a pacification of the situation in Europe. Now, before I continue, just to say, we have had some comments from the Russians about the terms that the Russians insist upon in terms of the settlement of the situation in Ukraine, and they come from Sergei Naryshkin, the head of the Russian intelligence service, the SVR. He recently gave a discussion to reporters. TASS has provided us, that's the official Russian news agency, with a summary. Over the course of it, in discussing the terms of a negotiated settlement in Ukraine, TASS summarizes Naryshkin as having said this: on Ukraine, a peaceful settlement of the conflict means, and this is a direct quote now, Ukraine's nuclear-free and neutral status. People tend to forget denuclearization was also one of Putin's demands at the time of the launch of the special military operation. Ukraine's nuclear-free and neutral status, the demilitarization and denazification of the Ukrainian state, an abolition of all discriminatory laws that were adopted after the coup d'etat in 2014. The settlement also must recognize the sovereignty of Russia's current borders. Now, current borders means the borders that, according to the Russian constitution, Russia achieved in September 2022, when Russia formally annexed, or if you prefer, united with the four regions. And that means that the entire territory of the four regions must be transferred to Russia. So that was what Naryshkin said to the reporters, and it is entirely consistent with everything else that we have been hearing from Russian officials. They are not moving, they're not shifting from this position. And then Naryshkin also said on the dialogue with the United States, the fact that Moscow and Washington are talking to each other, again, is a big positive, a favorable turn compared to relations with the administration of President Biden. The US administration clearly seeks to understand the causes of the Ukrainian crisis and sort them out. So clearly here we have a sign that the Russians, after the meeting between Putin and Witkoff, and perhaps after the rather positive meeting that took place in Istanbul about re-establishing diplomatic contacts, that the Russians are optimistic, moderately optimistic, about the direction that events are taking. Now, where does this all go? Where are we heading? I said at the start of the program that we are, I think, starting to move towards a divorce, eventual divorce, between the United States and Ukraine. Trump has seen that Putin is not prepared to agree to a simple, unconditional ceasefire. He's made that very clear. He made that clear many times. But then Putin has pointed out to Witkoff, and the Russians have pointed out to other US officials, that an unconditional ceasefire with Ukraine is completely unworkable, and there is no longer any real dispute that Ukraine, at least, is simply disregarding the agreed 30-day truce in terms of attacks on the Russian energy system. A Russian diplomat, Rodion Miroshnik, an ambassador, has said that Ukraine, over the course of this truce, has carried out at least 100 attacks on Russian energy facilities. And in truth, I followed this event closely. I've seen no real evidence of any significant reduction in Ukrainian attacks on Russian energy facilities over the period of this truce, and I don't think that there ever will be. I don't think that Zelensky, judging from the personality of the man, as again illustrated in that interview he gave to CBS, has any intention of ever abiding by a truce of this kind. So the Russians have probably provided all that detail to the US. In fact, they've said that they have done. And in fact, we know that Lavrov has already sent Rubio details of this. And it will have come to Trump. And it's not really been contradicted. As I've discussed in previous articles, previous programs, articles that have appeared in the British media, including The Guardian, now quite straightforwardly accept that the energy truce has never come into effect. They say that it is being ignored by both sides. The Russians insist that they are honouring it. You may believe or not what the Russians are saying, but there is no doubt that the Ukrainians are not honouring it. And the British media itself is acknowledging the fact. So Trump knows that. He's also seen that the Europeans are showing no willingness at all to compromise on even the mildest sanctions, such as, for example, lifting air links. They're not prepared to take any step at all to get the Black Sea Initiative operating again. So my own sense is that Trump's patience is running out, and that Zelensky's latest comments, his demonstrations, have shown to Trump again that this man, Zelensky, is impossible, that there are really no alternatives within the Ukrainian political system, amongst the politicians in Kiev, who are prepared to work with the Americans on a more realistic solution. The closest to that, Yulia Tymoshenko, is not prepared to go beyond a freeze of the conflict. In other words, she's prepared to go no further than the Kellogg plan, which the Russians, of course, have already rejected. Now, perhaps if things were left in, things like this could continue indefinitely. Trump could quietly disengage from the conflict. But as I've said in previous programs, the point is soon going to come when he has to make a decision. And I pointed out that before long, the weapons supplied by the Biden administration are going to run out. Funding provided by the Biden administration is going to run out. And then Trump has to make a decision whether he supplies Ukraine with more weapons and more funding and in effect sides with Zelensky, a man he clearly loathes, against Putin, a man for whom he has a certain degree of respect, and commits to the prolongation of a war which Trump recognizes is not in America's national interests. Now, there's been an article in The Guardian, of all places, which acknowledges that that point of decision is going to come, and it's going to come very soon. And it is written by David Schimmer, and David Schimmer was the director for Eastern Europe and Ukraine on no less a person than Joe Biden's National Security Council. And I'm not going to read the whole article. When one reads it, one discovers that Schimmer is an absolute supporter of the Biden policy on Ukraine, but he recognizes that American aid, continued support for Ukraine, is going to come to an end. And this is what he says. The war between Russia and Ukraine is approaching a historic turning point. Unless the Trump administration adjusts course, US military aid for Ukraine is about to cease. In the months before leaving office, Joe Biden made a series of decisions to augment Ukraine's stockpiles of vital munitions. Towards the end of 2024, the Department of Defense surged hundreds of thousands of artillery rounds, thousands of rockets, and hundreds of armored vehicles to Ukraine. And that December, Biden approved an additional $1.25 billion security assistance package for Ukraine, which has enabled the continued flow of US arms ever since, with the exception of the damaging pause ordered by Donald Trump in March. These decisions brought Ukraine time, but that time is running out. Ukraine is depleting its stockpiles of US munitions. The $1.25 billion aid package will soon be exhausted. The United States still possesses several $1 billion in drawdown authority, which could be used to send Ukraine additional security assistance. But since taking office, Trump has not approved a single military aid package for Ukraine. Even if Trump were to reverse course and utilize this remaining drawdown authority, the amount available is insufficient to sustain US support for Ukraine over time. To do that, Congress would need to approve additional Ukraine funding, which will not happen whilst the Republican Party controls both chambers and the White House. As a result, the era of US military aid to Ukraine is approaching its end. And then Schimmer goes on and discusses how Putin probably knows all about this and how that's why he's continuing the war, because he expects US military aid to run its course very soon. And then he says that the Europeans must step in and strip themselves of all the remaining weapons they have, all the remaining ammunition and equipment, They mustn't worry about being left entirely naked without weapons because Ukraine is too important. This is where the real war is now being fought. So they must give everything they've got to Ukraine to keep Ukraine going. And when they run out, they must also come forward and spend tens upon tens of billions of dollars buying more arms from the United States, also apparently in order to go on indefinitely defending Ukraine. The fact that Ukraine's military position has deteriorated throughout the period when Ukraine has been supplied with all of these weapons by the United States, its situation has got steadily worse over the last few months and is now deteriorating much faster. Well, that, of course, isn't something that Mr. Scheinmer wants to talk about. But anyway, let's move on. We could see that Donald Trump, before long, is going to have to make a decision. Does he start exercising his drawdown authority to send more weapons to Ukraine? He clearly doesn't believe that Zelensky is really interested in achieving peace. He also clearly blames Zelensky, at least in part, for starting the war in the first place. He doesn't like Zelensky, and he's no reason to think that anyone else in Ukraine who could take his place is going to do anything fundamentally different. So does he start exercising his drawdown authority? He's spoken with contempt about Zelensky's demand for 10 more Patriot missile batteries. Does he reverse his position completely and start supplying Ukraine with weapons? Well, we are talking about Donald Trump, and Trump, more than any other political leader, is capable of abrupt reversals. And there is a possibility, it must be said, that he will reverse his position on this. After all, last year we had a situation where the United States, the administration, had run out of funding for Ukraine, and for a period of time in the autumn and winter, Congress, with its Republican majority, Speaker Johnson, were refusing to authorize further aid packages for Ukraine. And then suddenly in April 2024, there was a reversal of position. The Republicans agreed to a $61 billion aid package. Not all of it for Ukraine, some of it for Israel, as I remember, and Taiwan. But anyway, there was this sudden authorization, including aid for Ukraine. And the person who made the decision to go forward with that was none other than Donald Trump. So he made that reversal then, a year ago. It is not impossible, it is not beyond the realm of the possible that he could do the same again. But I have to say that I think this time, if he were to do it, it would be more damaging, much more damaging to him. His base would probably struggle to understand why he was doing it, why he was reversing his position so much on something as central to his election victory as this. And I have to also say that I think there would be a lot more concern in Congress this time amongst his supporters there and within his administration about taking a step of this kind when moves towards achieving that rapprochement with Russia were going forward, and when senior people within the administration have had dealings with Zelensky and have come away with the view that this is somebody that they don't like and who they don't believe should be supported. So I think that putting aside Donald Trump's own visceral feelings, which I've come to the view will push him against deciding on further aid to Ukraine, I think the politics this time work against it. In April last year, Donald Trump had an election to win in November. He was up against an established consensus in the United States that established consensus in the United States behind support for Ukraine, one which took in the entire political class. He was also being advised, as is now clear, by General Kellogg, who appears to have successfully sold him with the plan of agreeing a ceasefire quickly with the Russians, sending European troops into Western Ukraine, making promises to kick the subject of NATO membership into the long grass, without, however, saying that it would never happen. And Kellogg probably advised Trump, this was back in April last year, that in order to make that plan work, he needed to continue support for Ukraine, at least for the time being. Well, Trump has tried Kellogg's plan. He's discovered that it hasn't worked. The Russians have not been impressed by the continued military support for Ukraine provided by the United States, nor have they been intimidated by the various threats of sanctions. So I think the political calculus this time is going to be different. And as Mr. Scheimer correctly says, Trump has never exercised his drawdown authority to provide further military aid to Ukraine, even though it is within his power to do so. So I think this time it's much more likely that Trump will finally make that decision, that it's time to move on from Ukraine, to leave it to the Europeans to sort out, and to leave it to the Europeans to move forward and take it further and decide what to do. And maybe all of these great plans that Witkoff and Putin talked about a complete restructuring of the security architecture of Europe, is too ambitious and beyond what can realistically be agreed and achieved, though one never knows for sure, but maybe it's too much. But anyway, one way or the other, still having better relations with Russia, getting some kind of economic deals on the table, perhaps getting Russian diplomatic help to sort out the situation in the Middle East, perhaps seeing whether a rapprochement with Russia will indeed cause the Russians to edge ever so slightly further away from China, with which the United States is now locked in what is looking like an increasingly prolonged confrontation. Well, it seems to me that the arguments for moving forward with all of those things look compelling, and I don't get the sense that there is huge opposition to this approach coming from within the United States itself. So there we are. Now, let me stress again, the situation can change from one day to the next. The internal battle within the United States, within the administration, is far from resolved. We still have arguments between Kellogg and Witkoff, between the neocons or the neocon-like faction and the realists, if you will. So as I said, it's not over. Trump has to make the decision, but his comments over the last couple of days suggest that after maybe thinking about ultimatums to Putin, about further sanctions threats to Putin, doing all of those things, Trump has finally come round to what, in my opinion, is the only realistic course, which is ending support for Ukraine and seeking that rapprochement with Russia. Now, the Europeans obviously are not going to be happy about this. The cries of betrayal are going to be extreme. To get a sense of how angry the Europeans now are and how afraid of the Americans they have become, just consider a recent report from the Financial Times, which has not been denied. It says that EU officials, and one wonders whether that means just the officials of the European Commission or whether it means officials of other EU states as well. For the record, I believe it is the second. In other words, British, German, well, not British, but German, French, Belgian, Dutch officials, for example, they've been told when they visit the United States to take with them only the most basic mobile phones and simplest computers because of the risk that they might be hacked and listened into by the Americans if they take more sophisticated equipment with them. Apparently, the Europeans are now taking the same kind of precautions about American espionage that they take when they travel to places like Ukraine, where the Russians, of course, have an elaborate surveillance operation, and China, and we're told that this is done specifically in order to protect against Chinese and Russian surveillance. Now, I have to say, I find all of this in some ways extraordinarily bizarre, because the reality is, as we all know, that the United States and its various intelligence agencies have routinely been listening in and monitoring conversations and discussions that European leaders engage in. I remember some years ago, at the time of the revelations by Edward Snowden about the activities of the NSA, just saying, that it was disclosed at some point that the Americans were listening in to the conversations that Angela Merkel was conducting through her mobile phone. And, of course, the Kremlin at that time, learning about how extensive the US reach was also rushed off to make all kinds of precautions to protect its secrets, and I know a little bit about those, but I'm not going to discuss them. But anyway, the point is that the Americans have been listening into what the Europeans have been doing, well, probably for decades. I suspect going all the way back to the 1960s, if I have to be honest about it. So it does seem very, very late in the day to start taking precautions against American surveillance. What it suggests to me is that it didn't matter if everybody was being listened into by the Americans when the Americans were part of the same team, but now that they are no longer seen as part of the same team, well, suddenly what was perfectly normal and accepted previously has now become something that we must all guard against. So anyway, there we go. Now, the other thing that perhaps, well, at least to me, says more than anything else, tells us more than anything else about the attitudes that the Europeans are taking, are certain further comments by the EU representative, High Representative for Foreign Policy, the EU's Foreign Minister, in other words, Kaja Kallas. She's come out and made further statements about how the EU will take action against any EU country that not only takes even the most minor steps, which could be said to infringe the sanctions policy against Russia. In fact, Kaja Kallas wants EU sanctions to be intensified even further, and in that she has the support of the French finance minister, whose name I forget, by the way, who says that the only way to push the Russians to peace is for the European Union to tighten sanctions so far that it pushes Russia's economy into oblivion. How that is possible, of course, is not explained, and one would have thought that by now it would be understood that, in fact, it is impossible. But anyway, the Europeans are talking like that. But anyway, Kaja Kallas is not only threatening European states that take any steps to maintain trading relations with Russia at even the most basic levels, or which might oppose further sanctions moves against Russia, but she's also threatening EU states that send representatives or to attend the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow on the 9th of May. Now, according to the Russians, something like 20 world leaders, heads of state and heads of government will be attending those Victory Day celebrations commemorating the 80th anniversary of the victory in the Second World War, the Allied victory in the Second World War. Xi Jinping and President Lula of Brazil will be amongst them, but probably there will be others. Well, we know that there will be others too. And of course, this was a joint victory against Germany and Italy and the Axis powers during the Second World War, the powers that carried out the most horrendous atrocities in human history. And, well, apparently, notwithstanding all of that, any European state that sends representatives is going to be punished by Kaja Kallas and the EU Commission and the European leadership, which I have to say I find astonishing. I would have thought that commemorating the Russian and Soviet sacrifice to the joint victory 80 years ago would be something that all Europeans, particularly at a time of tensions like this, ought to try to commemorate together. But of course, Kaja Kallas, whose country, Estonia, by the way, has an interesting history in terms of commemorating that victory. I'm not going to say more. Anyway, she takes a completely different view. So that gives us a sense of how the EU leadership continues to feel about Russia, and of course their support for Ukraine remains unstinting. The effect of that, of course, is that this European policy of unending hostility to Russia, continuing support for Ukraine, talking about further support for Ukraine, it is strengthening Zelensky's belief that he can go on defying both the Americans and the Russians at the same time. It is, in other words, consolidating Zelensky's self-confidence and making him believe that he can continue to prolong the war because he still has strong cards that he can continue to play. This despite the fact that the reality is that if the United States does withdraw military support, even if, as Mr. Shiner supposes, the Americans continue to provide intelligence to the Ukrainians, despite the fact that actual arms supplies end, the reality is that Ukraine will not be able to sustain the war for very long. As has been pointed out by several people, as was pointed out by the Greek Cypriot YouTuber Phidias in a live stream that we did with him on the Duran. It is delusional to think that Europe can help Ukraine to win the war by itself when Europe, together with the United States, was not able to help Ukraine win the war before. But there is a huge amount of delusion still around, and there still appears to be an unwillingness in Europe to move out of the absolutist comfort zone that descended on the top members of the European leadership in over the course of 2022. So that now brings me to a very brief rundown of what has actually been happening in the war over the last 24 hours. The various battles in Ukraine still continue. But before touching on that, very briefly, there has been an analysis of Russian recruitment levels by Yanis Klug, a German analyst. I don't pretend I know him very well, but he calculates that Russian recruitment levels continue at around 1,000 men a day, probably higher, more likely 1,400 men a day. There was a huge spike in recruitment in January of this year, December of last year and January of this year. Then there was a fall in February, but recruitment levels have started to grow again. I suspect that the reason for the fall in January, February had less to do with a reduction in willingness of Russian men to join the Russian army, and more to a pause in further recruitment by the Russian military after the surge in recruitments that took place at the end of last year, the very end of last year, and the beginning of this year. Since then, Russian recruitment levels have been steadily rising and could now be running at, well, over 1,200 men a day. As Mr. Klug says, more than enough to make up for any losses and to build up the Russian military, to make it stronger and to make it bigger, which is, of course, exactly what General Syrskyi, the Ukrainian military chief, said was happening in a recent interview which he gave, which I discussed in a recent program for the Duran. And this contrasts with an ever deepening crisis in recruitment for the Ukrainians. Not only is their military continuing to grow smaller, but it seems that the latest attempt, Zelensky's latest attempt, to try to get young people to sign up for the Ukrainian army has been a disastrous failure. We are told, and this comes from a report by Katerina Tushchenko, who I believe is a Ukrainian journalist, that less than 500 people have signed contracts under the 18 to 24 program so far. It originates from Pavel Palisa, who is in fact a member of Zelensky's own office, deputy head of the presidential office of the government of Ukraine. Ukraine, despite being offered a one-time cash benefit of 1 million hryvnia, about $24,000, only 500 people between 18 and 24 have signed up for the army. So it looks as if the entire mobilization program in Ukraine is collapsing. There is a very fine article about this, about the very high levels of motivation to join the army, which currently exist in Russia, and the very low motivation to join the army, which exists in Ukraine, provided by the American scholar Gordon Hahn, which, as I said, looks into this whole phenomenon in great detail. But anyway, let's move on to discuss quickly, briefly, the military situation. I said in my program yesterday that around 300 Ukrainian troops were trapped in a church in Gornal, in a monastery in Gornal in southern Kursk region. Apparently that siege continues. There is no way out for these men. And by contrast, the nearby village of Gornal looks like it's about to be captured by the Russians. Now, elsewhere, we've had a cascade of comments from Russian officials about the general state of the situation. We've had comments from our old friend Igor Kimakovsky, former official, I seem to remember, of the Lugansk government. Anyway, he says that we are moving from Pokrovsk, as you correctly noted, he said this on Solovyov Live, towards Konstantinovka. That is closer to the north of the Donetsk People's Republic, to this very large agglomeration, he means the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka agglomeration, which we have yet to liberate. An offensive operation on a wide front is afoot from Mirnograd all the way to Toretsk on a wide front. And he's absolutely right. We are seeing a major advance by the Russian forces north of Vozhizhenka and Ocheretino. And it looks as if there is nothing that the Ukrainians can do to repel it. And as he correctly says, the effect of this advance is gradually to create an encirclement of Pokrovsk and ultimately also to weaken Ukrainian positions in the area of Konstantinovka and in the salient between the area that the Ukrainians still control between Toretsk and Chasiv Yar. And Kimakovsky went on to say the situation near Pokrovsk was basically not very good when the enemy tried to shave off a sort of bulge, a sort of arc in the area of Kotlino, Otradnoye and Udachne. First, our guys were able to hold them off in the area of Shevchenko, and this foothold is currently being expanded. Meanwhile, the enemy failed to accomplish anything. And this is essentially what I've been saying all along. All of those Ukrainian counterattacks in the area of Kotlino, Pyshanye, Shevchenko, Udachne, Uspenovka, they were all unsuccessful. And the Russians, again, are on the advance there. So that's all from Kimakovsky. And, well, we've had more comments from other Russian officials about further advances by the Russians in other places. One Russian official has talked about how there is intense fighting still going on in Chasiv Yar. Ukraine's 28th Brigade in the Chasiv Yar area is putting up very serious resistance. Intense battles are ongoing there. They're reluctant to surrender this location, which overlooks the entire agglomeration north of Konstantinovka. As a result, they're doing everything they can to maintain control, even as they sustain heavy losses during their various counteroffensives. And then this official noted that the surrounding area is visible for dozens of kilometers if the city falls under Russian control. If Russian artillery is deployed in Chasiv Yar, it will gain significantly enhanced capabilities. The Ukrainian army is attempting to counterattack using armored units. They're trying to hold their ground. They still control some high-rise buildings, private residences and industrial zone. However, I believe this stronghold will fall soon. And that's consistent with what I've heard. The Russians are clearing now the central area of Chasiv Yar. The battle there has been very intense. The Ukrainians have thrown everything they have into trying to hold Chasiv Yar. But the battle for Chasiv Yar is indeed coming to an end, and I expect it will end probably this month. And there have been other Russian advances in other places. The Russians have managed to enlarge considerably the territory that they control in the southern end of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers, near Liman and Siversk. There appears to be a general Russian intention to mount an assault towards Liman fairly soon, and there's some suggestions that this group of forces that is being concentrated in this area, once Liman itself has been captured, will continue to advance towards the town of Izium. If Izium is captured, then that puts the Russians both east and north of Slavyansk, and regains for the Russians the front lines that they lost during Ukraine's counteroffensive of the autumn of 2022. So a deteriorating situation for the Ukrainians, but of course Zelensky is blind to that. He continues to speak about eventual victories over the Russians. The Europeans want a just and fair peace for Ukraine, which Ursula von der Leyen, in an incredible comment, said can only be achieved through a Ukrainian victory. How the Europeans or the Ukrainians imagine that can be achieved is, as I said, a complete mystery to me. But these deluded people still cling to that hope and that belief, even as it looks to me as if the United States, Donald Trump, are gradually preparing to cut off Ukraine. Anyway, that's my program for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.